Welcome to our second week in the book of James. As we talked about last week, it's easy to follow God on Sunday. It's easy to follow God when you're at church, singing, enjoying the church service, and being around God's people. It's a lot harder to follow God Monday through Saturday, but the book of James is here to help us out. James shows us how we can have a faith that handles all the difficulties and trials of life, a kind of faith that will get us through the other 6 days. This week, we're talking about faith when I don't want to do the right thing. In other words, we're talking about temptation. As James is going to show us, temptation is really just getting hooked. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but sometimes when my wife and I put our kids to bed, we just sit down on the couch and try and relax for a few minutes before we go to bed, and we'll turn on the television, and we'll find some new show that we've never seen before, and we're not that interested in it, but it's on, and nobody really wants to change the channel or find something else to watch, and so we watch the show, and then the next week we watch it again. And then the week after we watch it again, and all of a sudden we're hooked on this show that we never really cared about that much. Well, temptation is kind of like a hook that gets into us and pulls us in directions we don't want to go. But before we look at what James says about temptation, let's define it. Temptation is an enticement or invitation to disobey God. In other words, it's an invitation to sin, to do something that God says not to do. Often, the promise is if we give into our temptations, we're going to experience something that's more joyful than obeying God. And we all face temptation. It's common to everybody. And James begins his discussion of temptation by asking the question, where does temptation come from? Look at James 1, verse 13 through 15. And remember, when you are being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. James and the rest of the Bible teach us that temptation comes from our own sinful desires and Satan. That's the source of temptation. Temptation doesn't come from God. God may put trials in our life. God may test us, but God never tempts us to sin. It's opposite of God's character. That means that temptation comes from our own inward sinful desires or from Satan, who wants to pull us away from God. And you'll notice that James uses a fishing metaphor to explain temptation. It's like Satan baits a hook, and then we grab the hook. Satan catches us and pulls us away from God, drags us away from God. You can probably already see why temptation is such a problem, because if we give in to temptation, we find ourselves pulled away from God. Now, it's important to understand that the Bible says that temptation is not a sin. Being tempted isn't a sin because Jesus was tempted. He was tempted throughout his whole life, and he was sinless. It's what you do with temptation that makes it a sin or not. And let's look again at James to see why giving into temptation is such a problem. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. James uses the metaphor of giving birth, and he says that your evil desires give birth to sinful actions, and if your sinful actions go unchecked, eventually they give birth to death. You see, what James is saying is that giving into temptation disrupts our relationship with God and others. When we give into temptation, it wrecks our relationship with God. It separates us from God, and it even separates us from other people. I'm sure you've experienced that as you've given into temptations, as you've given into evil desires. It not only hurts your relationship with God, but it can hurt your relationship with other people. If you give into lust, it hurts your relationship with your spouse. If you give into gossip and lying, it hurts your relationship with friends. And so temptation is a big deal. It's a big problem. And ultimately, as sin goes on through our lives, obviously it pulls us further and further away from God. And if we don't deal with our sin, it results in death, spiritual death, eternal separation from God. So before you join us in the next video, press pause and talk about some of the questions related to what we've talked about.